My name is Loretta. I am 65 years old, and my occupation is a retired high school principal. She had the nerve to stand right in the middle of my living room, flashing a wicked, ice-cold smirk as if she were simply counting the days until my funeral. My daughter-in-law was absolutely certain my beautiful home was her guaranteed inheritance, a free ticket to the life she always wanted. That smug look on her face completely vanished the moment she saw what was actually waiting for her inside my heavy steel safe. 20 years ago, I lost my beloved husband, unexpectedly leaving me alone to raise our son Jamal. I poured my heart, my soul, and my entire life savings into that boy. I worked double shifts, skipped every vacation, and stretched every single dime so Jamal could graduate completely debt-free and live a comfortable life. My pride and joy, aside from my son, was my beautifully restored Brooklyn brownstone. It was the physical proof of my late husband's sweat and my own relentless perseverance. But the peace I worked so hard to build was shattered on a typical Sunday afternoon. I walked quietly into my immaculate living room, carrying a tray of sweet tea, only to catch Jamal's wife Chloe running a measuring tape along my vintage mahogany bookshelves. When I asked her exactly what she was doing, she did not even flinch. She just turned, gave me that freezing smirk, and coldly muttered that she was just planning ahead. She boldly declared that the house would be hers someday, so she might as well figure out which walls she was going to knock down. And Jamal, the son I sacrificed everything for, sat right in the next room, completely silent, pretending he heard absolutely nothing. That illusion of a perfect family shattered on what was supposed to be a quiet Sunday afternoon. I had spent all morning in the kitchen preparing a beautiful dinner, roasting a chicken and making the macaroni and cheese Jamal has loved since he was a little boy. The house smelled of comfort and love. I poured a fresh pitcher of sweet tea and carried the heavy silver tray out to the living room, expecting to find my son and his wife relaxing before we sat down to eat. Instead, I walked in to find Chloe, standing by the far wall, her back to me. She was holding a bright yellow measuring tape, stretching it across the beautiful vintage mahogany bookshelves my late husband had built with his own 2 hands. I stopped in my tracks, the ice clinking against the glass pitchers as my hands shook slightly. I asked her exactly what she thought she was doing. Chloe slowly let the measuring tape snap back into its plastic casing. She turned around to face me, and she did not even have the decency to look embarrassed. She looked me right in the eye, flashed a wicked, ice-cold smirk, and casually flipped her hair over her shoulder. "Just planning ahead, Loretta," she muttered, her voice dripping with absolute entitlement. "After all, this house will be mine someday. I might as well figure out right now which walls I am knocking down." The air in the room instantly turned to ice. The absolute audacity of her words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My breathing stopped. I stood there holding that heavy tray, waiting for Jamal to say something. He was sitting right in the next room. There was no door between the dining room and the living room. I knew he heard every single word of that blatant disrespect. But the house was dead silent. My son, the boy I had sacrificed my entire youth to protect and provide for, kept his mouth shut, pretending he heard absolutely nothing. In that suffocating silence, my heart broke. But something else inside me woke up. After that Sunday with the measuring tape, a heavy shift took over my home. Chloe stopped bothering to pretend. The subtle passive-aggressive shade she used to throw transformed into blatant, open disrespect. Every time she stepped foot into my house, she brought a storm of unsolicited criticism disguised as concern. She would walk into my kitchen, watch me prepare a meal, and sigh loudly. She would tell me my recipes were too heavy for someone my age. She would look at the fine porcelain plates I laid out and suggest I switch to paper so I would not strain my wrists washing them. It was a relentless campaign to make me feel old, tired, and incapable. It was not just the cooking, it was the house itself. My Brooklyn brownstone has 3 floors, and I have walked up and down those stairs every day for over 30 years. My knees are fine and my heart is strong. But to listen to Chloe, you would think I was 1 step away from a wheelchair. Whenever I walked down the steps to greet them, she would rush over with this exaggerated fake panic, grabbing my elbow as if I were made of glass. She would tell Jamal loud enough for me to hear that it was simply irresponsible for a woman my age to be navigating so many stairs alone. She said I was becoming too frail, that maintaining a property this size was a hazard to my health. I am a retired high school principal. I spent 30 years managing hundreds of teenagers' teachers and a massive school budget. I know how to manage a household, but the most heartbreaking part was Jamal. My son, the boy I raised to be a strong, respectful man, just stood there and let it happen. When I pulled him aside to ask why his wife was suddenly acting like my parole officer, he refused to look me in the eye. He rubbed the back of his neck and mumbled that Chloe was just a naturally anxious person. He told me she just worried about the elderly and begged me not to take it personally, saying she only wanted what was best for me. Jamal was completely spineless, shrinking into the background rather than defending the mother who had given him everything. Then the true nature of their visits became agonizingly clear. Sunday family dinners used to be a sacred time for Jamal and me, but Chloe began bringing her brother Bradley uninvited. Bradley was a slick, fast-talking white American real estate agent, and he carried himself with an arrogance that instantly rubbed me the wrong way. He would swagger into my foyer in his expensive suits, smelling of strong cologne, looking around my home not as a guest, but as an appraiser. The first time he came over, he did not bring a bottle of wine or a dessert. He brought business cards. Dinner conversations turned into unbearable interrogations. Bradley would sit at my dining table eating the food I spent hours preparing and casually talk about the gentrification happening in my neighborhood. He would lean back in his chair, swirling his wine glass, and tell Jamal how much the property values in Brooklyn had skyrocketed. Then he would turn his sharp gaze to me. He used buzzwords like cashing out equity and maximizing return on investment. He told me that holding on to a massive brownstone was a terrible financial strategy for a retiree. He constantly brought up the concept of aging in place, suggesting that a small, single-level condo in a cheap estate would be much better suited for my lifestyle. He spoke about my home, the sanctuary where my husband and I had poured our love, as if it were just a quick flip project waiting to be liquidated. Chloe would chime in right on cue, agreeing with her brother. She would talk about the burden of property taxes and roof repairs, painting a bleak picture of my future if I stayed. They were running a coordinated psychological routine right in my dining room. I wanted to throw them both out into the street. I wanted to scream that I owned this house free and clear, and that my finances were none of their concern. But every time the anger rose in my throat, I looked at Jamal. He sat there silently picking at his food. For his sake, to keep the peace and not drive my only son away, I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. I smiled politely and changed the subject. But deep down, a heavy, dark suspicion had taken root in my soul. They were plotting something, and I needed to know exactly what it was. 30 years of running a high school teaches you a great deal about human nature. You learn to read the subtle shifts in body language, the lies hiding behind forced smiles, and the quiet plotting that happens just out of sight. My seasoned intuition was screaming at me that Chloe and her brother Bradley were calculating a devastating move against me. I was not about to let 2 greedy opportunists blindside me in the sanctuary my late husband and I built. The very next morning, I took a quiet trip to an electronics store downtown. I bought a high-definition security camera, cleverly disguised as an ordinary digital clock. When I returned to my Brooklyn brownstone, I placed it right on the vintage mahogany bookshelf in the living room. I positioned it carefully so it had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire space, including the dining area. The sleek device blended in seamlessly with the antique decor my husband and I had collected over the decades. No one would ever suspect a thing. A few days later, Thursday evening rolled around. This was my regular night for my neighborhood book club meeting. I had specifically told Jamal and Chloe earlier that week that I would be out of the house until at least 9 o'clock. I put on my warm coat, locked the heavy front door, and walked 2 blocks down to the local cafe where my friends were gathering. But my mind was absolutely not on the novel we were supposed to discuss. After taking my seat and ordering a cup of hot herbal tea, I made a polite excuse about needing to check an urgent email. I slipped my smartphone out of my purse beneath the table and opened the security camera application. The live feed loaded instantly, showing my quiet, immaculate living room bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights outside. For a few tense minutes, nothing happened. I was almost ready to convince myself that I was just being a paranoid old woman. But then the heavy brass lock on my front door turned. My breath caught sharply in my throat as the door swung wide open. Chloe and Bradley strolled right into my home, as if their names were already printed on the property deed. Chloe carelessly tossed her expensive leather handbag onto my pristine sofa, while Bradley immediately walked over to the antique liquor cabinet my husband had built. He poured himself a generous glass of my best scotch without a second thought. I watched the glowing screen in absolute horror as Chloe jingled a familiar set of keys in her hand. It was the spare set I had given my son Jamal for absolute emergencies only. He had surrendered the key to my house to his ambitious wife without even asking my permission. I pressed my phone closer to my ear to catch the audio. Bradley took a desperate gulp of the scotch and started pacing frantically back and forth across my expensive Persian rug. He looked completely unhinged, running a nervous hand through his hair and practically shouting about his impending financial ruin. He was drowning in massive debt. I heard him explicitly confess that he owed a staggering amount of money to dangerous people. Worse than his debts, Bradley admitted his real estate license was under severe review. The state licensing board had finally caught wind of his shady dealings, and he was on the verge of losing his career and facing legal action. He told his sister he needed a massive cash injection immediately, or he was going to end up in jail or completely bankrupt. Chloe did not look shocked by his criminal behavior. Instead, she calmly walked over, placed a reassuring hand on his tense shoulder, and told him to calm down because she had already formulated the perfect solution. Chloe methodically explained her sickening conspiracy to her brother. She revealed that she had already contacted an unethical lawyer to quietly draft a fraudulent quitclaim deed for my Brooklyn brownstone. Her sinister plan was to physically bury that legal deed inside a thick, intimidating stack of routine medical proxy paperwork. She knew I trusted Jamal implicitly. Her strategy was to manipulate my maternal love, telling me that the overwhelming paperwork was just a standard requirement to ensure Jamal could make emergency medical decisions for me. She fully intended to trick me into blindly signing away the legal rights to my $1.5 million home. Bradley stopped his frantic pacing and asked her what exactly they were going to do with me once they officially stole the house. Chloe laughed. It was a cold, wicked, soulless sound that made my blood run like ice in my veins. She said they would forcefully flip the brownstone, sell it to the highest bidder, split the cash right down the middle and shove me into a state-run facility. She specifically mentioned finding a run-down, underfunded facility where I would be entirely out of sight and out of mind, left to rot in misery while they lived the high life on my late husband's hard-earned legacy. Bradley looked incredibly greedy, but a brief flicker of doubt crossed his face. I watched him lean casually against the mahogany bookshelf right next to the hidden camera and ask the one question that was already tearing my soul apart. He asked Chloe what Jamal was going to say about them maliciously throwing his own mother into a terrible nursing home. Chloe took a sip of Bradley's scotch, looked straight ahead with dead eyes, and delivered the most heartbreaking line I have ever heard in my 65 years on this earth. She said Jamal is so whipped he will sign off on her mental decline if I tell him it is for the best. She proudly bragged that she had already been laying the sinister groundwork, actively gaslighting my son into believing that I was rapidly losing my mind. She was making up horrific stories about me forgetting things, leaving the stove on, and acting erratic. She was completely confident that my own flesh and blood would choose her toxic lies over my well-being and safety. She was absolutely certain Jamal would betray the mother who gave him everything without a single second thought, just to keep her happy. I sat in that bustling cafe, feeling as though I had been plunged into a frozen lake. The pain of that betrayal was a sharp physical agony in my chest. The daughter-in-law I had graciously welcomed into my family was a ruthless predator. The son I had sacrificed my entire youth for was a weak, spineless pawn who would rather see me locked away in a nightmare facility than stand up to his greedy wife. For a few agonizing minutes, profound grief washed over me. I wanted to cry for the boy I had raised, for the family I thought I had built. But I am a strong black woman who survived the sudden loss of my husband and raised a child single-handedly. I survived 30 grueling years in the public school system, managing chaos. I do not simply break down and surrender. The tears I felt burning behind my eyes never fell. Instead, that profound grief evaporated completely, instantly replaced by a cold, calculated, and absolute rage. I closed the camera application on my phone and took a deep, steadying breath. I knew exactly what I had to do next. I pulled up my contact list and scrolled until I found the number of an old friend, a fierce powerhouse attorney preparing to go to war for my life. The following 2 weeks turned into a masterclass in psychological warfare. Chloe and her brother Bradley put their sickening plan into active motion, and if I had not seen that security camera footage with my own 2 eyes, they might have actually convinced me I was truly losing my mind. It started with small and highly aggravating things. I would leave my house keys on the brass hook by the front door, exactly where I have placed them every single day for 30 years without fail. 2 hours later, those keys would be completely gone, only to magically reappear under a pile of junk mail in the kitchen or stuffed deep between the sofa cushions. My reading glasses would vanish from my nightstand and somehow show up inside the refrigerator next to the milk. I watched the hidden camera feed on my phone every single night. I saw Chloe sneaking into my home with her spare key, while I was out watering the back garden, deliberately moving my personal items and smirking to herself in my empty living room. It took every ounce of strength and dignity I possessed not to march over to her house and slap her right across the face. But I knew I had to play the long game. I had to let them think they were winning this twisted battle. I put on my absolute best performance, acting confused and frustrated whenever Jamal was around, rubbing my temples and apologizing profusely for my sudden forgetfulness. Jamal would just sigh heavily, looking at me with this crushing mixture of pity and annoyance, while Chloe stood right behind him, rubbing his back with her fake and sugary sympathy. But then their twisted little game escalated from petty parlor tricks to downright dangerous sabotage. One Tuesday afternoon, I had just finished baking a peach cobbler and went upstairs to fold some laundry. I knew Chloe had dropped by to use my study because she claimed her internet was down. 10 minutes later, Jamal came bursting through the heavy front door, shouting my name in absolute panic. I rushed downstairs as fast as I could to find my beautiful kitchen reeking of natural gas. 3 of the burners on my vintage stove were turned all the way up, pouring unlit toxic gas straight into the air. Jamal rushed over to twist them off, coughing and waving his hands wildly, looking at me as if I were a complete stranger who had lost all touch with reality. Chloe came running out of the study, covering her mouth with her manicured hands, literally forcing crocodile tears into her eyes. She put on the performance of a lifetime. She cried to my son, telling him that she had just walked in and found the kitchen filled with deadly gas, loudly claiming I must have left the burners on and forgotten to light them. She looked at Jamal with those fake, tear-filled eyes and whispered that I was becoming a severe danger to myself and everyone around me. She said it was an absolute miracle she arrived when she did, or the entire brownstone could have exploded into flames. I looked at my son, the boy I had protected and nurtured his entire life, waiting for him to defend me. I waited for him to say his mother was always meticulous, that she would never do something so reckless or careless. Instead, Jamal looked at me with pure terror and utter exasperation. He shook his head and told me that things were getting totally out of hand. He actually said out loud that maybe Chloe was right and that I needed serious professional help before I ended up killing someone. The betrayal sliced right through my soul like a jagged blade. My own son was choosing her toxic fabricated lies over his own mother. They waited until Friday evening to deliver their final lethal blow. Jamal was conveniently working late at his corporate office, leaving me entirely alone in the house. I was sitting at my mahogany dining room table, enjoying a warm cup of chamomile tea, when the heavy oak front door swung open without so much as a knock. Chloe and Bradley marched into my home with the supreme confidence of conquerors. They did not greet me or show a single ounce of basic respect. They simply walked right up to the dining table and stood over me, their tall shadows blocking out the warm light from the crystal chandelier overhead. Bradley was holding a thick, dense stack of complicated legal documents. He tossed them onto the polished wood right in front of me with a loud, disrespectful thud that echoed in the quiet room. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and put on his slick, fast-talking real estate voice. He tried to tell me that these papers were just a standard routine medical care proxy. He lied straight to my face, claiming that Jamal was incredibly worried about my recent memory lapses and the incredibly dangerous incident with the stove. Bradley insisted that Jamal had personally requested this specific paperwork to ensure someone could make emergency medical and financial decisions for me if my mind continued to decline. He smiled that greasy, arrogant smile of his, speaking down to me as if I were a naive, uneducated child who could not comprehend basic English. But I did not even look down at the papers scattered across my table. I kept my posture completely straight and looked directly into Chloe's eyes. Seeing that I was not reaching for the pen, she finally dropped the sweet, caring daughter-in-law act completely. The charming mask melted away, revealing the cold, greedy predator I had seen on my security camera footage. She leaned over the dining table, pressing her palms flat against the wood, bringing her face uncomfortably close to mine. Her eyes were hard and completely void of any human empathy or warmth. She told me to stop playing games right now. She stated flatly that my mind was clearly going that everyone in the neighborhood could see it and that I was no longer fit to live in a multi-million-dollar Brooklyn brownstone by myself. She flat out told me that if I did not sign that quitclaim deed the easy way, they would drag me into a cold courtroom. She threatened to bring the fake gas company reports, the missing items, and Jamal's own heartbreaking testimony before a judge to declare me legally and mentally incompetent. She promised she would strip me of my rights, take the house anyway, and lock me away in a state-run facility so fast my head would spin. Bradley pulled a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket and placed it deliberately on top of the fraudulent documents. Chloe stood up straight, crossed her arms over her chest, and delivered her final demand. She told me I had exactly 24 hours to sign my name on that dotted line. If the papers were not signed by tomorrow evening, they would file the incompetency petition the very next morning. They turned around and walked right out of my home, leaving the front door wide open, absolutely certain they had just broken my spirit. The next 24 hours were without a doubt the longest, most agonizing hours of my entire life. I did not sleep a single wink that night. Instead, I sat in the dark of my bedroom, letting the sheer magnitude of their betrayal wash over me until the sorrow hardened into something unbreakable. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Chloe's voice echoing in my head, laughing about throwing me into a state-run facility. I heard Bradley's greedy calculations, and I saw the image of my own son being described as a whipped pawn. I am an older black woman who has survived the loss of the love of my life and the daily battles of running a city high school. I have disciplined, unruly teenagers, negotiated with hostile city councils, and managed crisis after crisis in neighborhoods where weakness is simply not an option. I know exactly how to prepare for a fight. By the time the sun came up over Brooklyn, my tears were gone. My back was straight, and my plan was flawlessly arranged. I picked up the phone that afternoon and called my son. I made sure my voice sounded shaky, frail, and completely defeated. I told Jamal that the stress of the past few weeks was simply getting to be too much for me. I told him that my mind felt clouded, that I was so tired of fighting, and that I was ready to just sign whatever paperwork Chloe and Bradley wanted me to sign to ensure my future was secure. I asked them to come over that evening around 7 o'clock. The relief in Jamal's voice was sickening, but it was the background noise on that call that truly turned my stomach. I could hear Chloe actually squeal with delight in the distance. She thought she had broken me. She thought her little psychological games had finally worn down my defenses, and that she had won the ultimate prize. Evening arrived, casting long shadows across my polished hardwood floors. I sat in the living room wearing a simple faded cardigan over my shoulders, hunching forward just a little bit to complete the illusion of a broken-down old woman who could no longer handle the burden of her own existence. When the doorbell rang, I took my time getting up, dragging my feet across the floor to make them wait. I unlocked the heavy front door, and there they were. Jamal, Chloe, and her slick, fast-talking brother Bradley. They practically pushed their way inside, rubbing their hands together. Jamal could barely look me in the eye. He stared down at his expensive shoes, shuffling his feet like a guilty schoolboy called into the principal's office, knowing he was doing something unspeakable. But Chloe and Bradley, they were practically salivating with greed. They looked like two hungry wolves circling a wounded animal, completely unaware that they were walking straight into a trap. Chloe was wearing a bright red dress and full makeup, as if she were coming to a massive celebration. She immediately linked her arm through mine, squeezing me with that fake, sugary affection that made me want to scream and physically throw her out of my house. She patted my hand and cooed about how proud she was of me for making the smart choice. Bradley was already holding his expensive leather briefcase, clutching it against his chest like it contained the winning lottery ticket. They walked me right into the dining room, where the stack of fraudulent documents was already waiting on the mahogany table, exactly where they had left them the day before. Bradley eagerly pulled out his shiny silver pen and placed it right next to the signature line, tapping his fingers on the wood with impatient anticipation. He told me to just sign right there on the dotted line, so we could put all this nasty business behind us and get me the proper medical care I supposedly needed. I stood there looking at the pen, and then I let out a long, heavy sigh, staring down at the table. I told them that before I signed away my life and my future, I needed to get something very important from the study. I told them there was a specific document I needed to include with the paperwork, something I had been keeping safe for a very long time, that related to my late husband's estate. Chloe and Bradley exchanged a very quick, very greedy smirk. I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought I was going to pull out my last will and testament, or maybe hand over the hidden cash and antique jewelry my late husband used to keep locked away. They thought they were about to get a massive unearned bonus on top of stealing my brownstone. I turned and slowly walked down the hallway toward the study. I heard their footsteps right behind me, sticking to me like glue. They were not going to let me out of their sight for a single second, terrified that I might change my mind or become confused. We entered the study, which was lined from floor to ceiling with books and illuminated by a single brass desk lamp. In the corner of the room, bolted directly into the foundation of the house, was my heavy vintage steel floor safe. It is an old-fashioned combination safe, the kind that takes extreme patience and precision to open. I knelt down on the rug, pretending that my joints were aching and stiff, letting out a small groan just for dramatic effect. Chloe and Bradley hovered right over my shoulders, leaning in with absolute fascination. I could literally hear Bradley breathing heavily through his nose, his eyes wide and hungry as he watched me spin the dial. Left, right, left. The heavy tumblers clicked into place with a satisfying metallic sound. I grabbed the cold steel handle and pulled the heavy door open. They leaned in so close I could smell the overpowering stench of Bradley's expensive cologne mingling with the scent of Chloe's sickeningly sweet perfume. They were fully expecting stacks of $100 bills or velvet boxes overflowing with diamonds and gold. Instead, I reached inside and pulled out a single crisp manila folder. I did not take the pen to sign their dirty quitclaim deed. I stood up tall, completely abandoning the hunched, fragile posture I'd been faking all day. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and looked Chloe dead in the eye with a gaze so sharp it could cut glass. I pulled a freshly stamped, heavily notarized legal document from the folder and slammed it down onto the top of my desk. I told them this was an irrevocable trust. I watched the confused, arrogant smirk slowly slide right off Chloe's face, turning into a mask of pure shock as I explained exactly what that meant. I announced in a voice that shook the walls of that study that my beautiful $1.5 million Brooklyn brownstone had already been legally transferred into an educational foundation. I told them this foundation was designed entirely to fund college scholarships for underprivileged Black youth in our community, boys and girls, who actually work hard and respect their elders instead of trying to steal from them. I told them I hold an ironclad life estate, which means I have the absolute legal right to live in this house until the very day I take my final breath, and absolutely nobody can ever sell it out from under me. I stared Bradley down and told him that there was absolutely no equity to cash out, no flip to be made, and absolutely no money to save him from the dangerous people he owed. The house belonged to the trust, and neither of them would ever see a single red cent of it. The silence in that study was so heavy, it felt like the air had been sucked completely out of the room. Bradley's face turned the color of wet chalk. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Chloe physically stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the bookshelf to steady herself, her eyes darting wildly from me to the documents and back again. She started to stammer, shaking her head back and forth, claiming that this was impossible, that I could not legally do this without Jamal's consent, because he was my sole heir. But before Bradley could explode into a rage and unleash whatever temper tantrum he was brewing, the heavy wooden doors of my study pushed wide open. Stepping out from the adjoining library was my attorney, a fierce, brilliant woman who has never lost a fight in her entire career. She walked into the room carrying a thick, heavy binder and a devastating, completely merciless smile. She dropped that binder right onto the desk next to the trust with a deafening slam that made both Chloe and Bradley jump out of their skin. My lawyer looked right at Bradley and told him she had brought some incredibly light reading for him to enjoy in his impending jail cell. She opened the binder and pulled out the freshly printed transcripts of the hidden security camera footage capturing every single word of his and Chloe's sickening conspiracy. She dropped the transcripts right on top of his precious real estate documents, reading aloud the exact quotes where they planned to forcefully shove me into a state-run facility. Then she pulled out a detailed, comprehensive dossier, exposing every single one of Bradley's shady real estate dealings, his impending catastrophic bankruptcy, and the active investigations currently being conducted against his professional license by the state board. Finally, she handed him a formal, legally binding cease and desist order, demanding that he and his sister never step foot on my property ever again, under threat of immediate arrest for trespassing and elder abuse. I stepped out from behind the desk, walking right up to Chloe, who was now trembling from head to toe. I verbally annihilated them, exposing every single detail of their toxic psychological warfare. I told Chloe I knew she hid my reading glasses. I knew she moved my house keys. And I absolutely knew she intentionally turned on the gas burners in my kitchen to make it look like I was losing my mind. I told her she was a pathetic, greedy opportunist who thought she could outsmart a woman who has spent 30 years outsmarting teenagers who are twice as clever as she could ever hope to be. I told her she had vastly underestimated the intelligence and the sheer willpower of a mother defending her own territory and her own legacy. I looked at Bradley and told him he was nothing but a slick failure, wearing a cheap suit and a fake smile, completely incapable of making an honest living without trying to steal from widows. I stripped away their power entirely, leaving them standing there as the absolute frauds they truly were. Then I slowly turned to face Jamal. My son was standing in the doorway, staring at the transcripts my lawyer had thrown on the desk, his face buried in his hands, shaking with shame. I looked at the boy I gave birth to, and I told him he was the biggest disappointment of my entire life. I told him he stood by while his wife plotted to throw his own mother into a miserable state-run facility, all because he was too weak to stand up and be a man. I pointed a finger straight at the front door and told all three of them to get out of my house right this second, before I had the police physically drag them out in handcuffs. I told them they had exactly 1 minute to leave my property, and they were never to return. They scrambled out of my study, tripping over their own feet, and bolted out the front door, leaving behind nothing but the undeniable truth that this old woman had completely destroyed them. The aftermath of that night in my study was swift, absolute, and completely merciless. My fierce attorney did not bluff for a single second. First thing Monday morning, she forwarded the entire unedited transcript, along with the high-definition video files from my hidden security camera, directly to the State Real Estate Licensing Board. Bradley was instantly suspended and stripped of his license, pending a massive criminal investigation for attempted elder fraud. Without his shiny professional title and his ability to run shady backdoor deals, his entire pathetic house of cards collapsed entirely. The dangerous people he explicitly confessed to owing money to did not care that his sister had spectacularly failed to steal a Brooklyn brownstone. They only cared about collecting their cash. He had to flee the state in the dead of night, just to keep himself out of a hospital bed. Or worse. As for Chloe, the harsh reality of her monumental failure hit her like a speeding freight train. Without my $1.5 million home to flip, and with her brother completely ruined her lavish lifestyle, instantly dried up. The designer clothes, the expensive luxury dinners, and the constant arrogant bragging all vanished into thin air. And just as I had always expected, the very moment the free money ran out, so did her fake affection for my son. When the crushing financial pressure mounted, she turned on Jamal like a starved dog. She viciously blamed him for being too weak to force me into signing those fraudulent papers earlier. Their toxic marriage, which was built on absolutely nothing but greed and manipulation, crumbled into dust before the year was even over. She emptied whatever was left of their joint bank accounts, packed her bags, and left him standing completely alone. It did not take long for Jamal to show up at my front door. He stood on the porch of the beautiful home he had cowardly tried to help steal, looking completely defeated. He looked at me with those sad brown eyes, the exact same eyes he had when he was a little boy who had scraped his knee and desperately begged for my comfort. He cried real heavy tears this time. He told me how deeply sorry he was, how he finally realized he had foolishly thrown away the only woman who had ever truly loved him unconditionally for a gold digger, who only saw him as a convenient tool. He pleaded, asking if he could come inside, if we could just sit down and try to rebuild our shattered family. I looked at the son I had poured my entire heart and soul into. I remembered the long, exhausting nights working double shifts to pay for his college tuition so he could graduate debt-free. But I also sharply remembered the cold, heavy silence when his entitled wife measured my bookshelves. I remembered the horrifying way he was perfectly willing to let them lock me away in a miserable state-run facility just to keep the peace in his own toxic household. I stood tall in the doorway, keeping the heavy oak door firmly between us. I told him I loved him because a mother never truly stops loving her child. But I also firmly told him that my love does not mean I ever have to be his willing victim. I told him he made his final choice when he sat silently while they plotted to systematically destroy my life. I told him he chose his own path, and now he had to walk it entirely alone. I firmly closed the door, and for the first time, I did not shed a single tear. The very next day, I had every single lock on the brownstone changed and installed a top-of-the-line security system. I was taking absolutely no chances. But inside my home, the air finally felt light, clean, and breathable again. The heavy, dark cloud of their suffocating greed was completely gone forever. I found an immense, profound peace that I had not felt since my beloved husband passed away. I started hosting my neighborhood book club in the living room again, filling the house with the loud, joyful laughter of genuine friends who loved me exactly for who I am. My days are now filled with a beautiful and incredibly fulfilling new purpose. Working alongside the Educational Foundation has brought so much radiant light into my life. Watching those brilliant, hardworking young Black students receive college scholarships from the irrevocable trust we established is the greatest reward I could ever ask for. My late husband's enduring legacy is actively protecting the next generation, and my own future is absolutely secure. I am living my golden years exactly on my own terms, in my own beloved home, completely free from toxicity, manipulation, and fear. I have finally learned that true family is not always determined by blood. True family is made up of the people who respect your dignity, honor your lifelong sacrifices, and love you without a hidden agenda. I want to take a brief moment right now to speak directly to all the beautiful women listening to my voice today. We spend our entire lives giving everything we have to our families. We constantly pour our sweat, our tears, and our unconditional love into raising our children, building our homes, and creating a safe haven for the people we hold dear. But I had to learn a very hard and painful lesson, and I want to share it with you, woman to woman. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. Just because you brought someone into this world does not give them the right to treat you like a stepping stone. Never let anyone, not even your own flesh and blood, make you feel like you are past your prime or unworthy of respect. You worked hard for what you have, and you deserve to enjoy the fruits of your labor in absolute peace. Do not ever let greed disguise itself as genuine concern. Trust your deep intuition, always listen to that quiet voice inside your head, and do whatever it takes to secure your future. Protect your peace and absolutely protect your assets. You owe it to yourself to live out your golden years, surrounded by genuine love, not toxic manipulation. If this story resonated with you today, go ahead and hit that like button right now. Please subscribe to the channel for more truths and real-life stories like mine. I would also love to hear from you, so let me know in the comments. Where are you watching from today, and exactly what time is it over there right now? Thank you so much for spending your valuable time with me and listening to my journey. Always stay strong, queens. Until next time.